Hello, and thank you for joining us this lunchtime. My name is David Ward, and I'm the Artistic Director of Northern Opera Group. All this year, we've been researching the 300-year history of opera in Leeds as part of the Leeds Opera Story. You can find out more about the project and visit our online exhibition at leedsoperastory.co.uk. Now, of course, one of the most significant operatic milestones in Leeds was the launch of Opera North in 1978. And it's my great pleasure this lunchtime to be talking with the man who's been with the company since the very start, leader of the Orchestra of Opera North, David Greed. Good afternoon to you, David.
Hi, David. How are you? Hello, everybody.
Very well, thank you. Where do we find you this afternoon?
I am at home in Headingley, just not far from you.
Wonderful. And the sun is actually out today as well.
Finally, yeah.
Which is delightful. If you're watching along at home and you've got any questions for David, then please do write them in the chat on YouTube and we'll come to them as we get them. Now, before we start talking about Opera North, let's just actually kind of have a little bit of a chat about your role. I'm sure we all kind of know what a violinist does in an orchestra, but the leader of an orchestra, what does that mean? What does it mean that you kind of do?
Well, I've been asked this question a lot, and it never gets any easier to answer it. But I think I've managed over the years to sort of narrow it down to three things. So one is to try and play as well as you can and set most of the examples you want to set in one's own playing. I mean, that was clearly a big part of what I'm supposed to do. Secondly is, for me, and these are all personal things, to try and create a really positive atmosphere in rehearsal, which takes on board all sorts of things. But I think you can have influence not by saying words, but just from the way you work. And humor is an important thing for me. You know, if you have to diffuse a sort of tricky situation, I think humor can be extremely valuable. I mean, it could go terribly wrong as well. So, you know, it's a thing you have to try and develop.
Yeah, well, I always think the best directors and conductors are also sort of great psychologists as well. You know, there's something about knowing how to tap into people, how you say, kind of how to change a mood as well. So,
well, yeah, I mean, I certainly wouldn't call myself any sort of psychologist, but to tap into the more positive things is something that you can pick up as the years go by. And then the other thing, of course, is to have a great relationship, if possible, with the conductor. And you know, we've had some really great conductors at Opera North over the years, and maybe some not quite so great. And I think that's where the real work has to be done. And so I try and be supportive, which is definitely the job of a leader. Communicate well, maybe offer advice if, you know, you've got to be receptive to advice if it's going to work. And some conductors aren't fantastic at that sometimes, but it's a very important piece of the jigsaw, I think, to be able to communicate with the conductor and help him or her through problems if their gestures aren't working.
And I suppose a big role in terms of Opera North is, as you say, you have music directors. So, you know, most of the time you'll have a conductor who's quite familiar to the company, but there'll also be those conductors that kind of come in and out as well. So I suppose a big part of your job is helping those visiting conductors get to know the orchestra, how to work with them and that sort of thing as well. Oh,
yeah, for sure. I suppose the guest conductor area is as big as the familiar conductor. We have our music director, and we just have a new one, which is terrific. And then we have a series. We have staff conductors, and we have all the guest conductors. And I think the rehearsal process for the orchestra and the conductor is a relatively short one. If you're a member of the chorus or one of the principal singers, your rehearsal period could last, I don't know, 8 to 10 weeks, because they have to learn the moves, they have to learn the words, everything. For the orchestra, the scenario might be that the orchestra will come into that process towards the end. So we might have a couple of days of rehearsals and a day's rehearsal with the singers, and then 3 days rehearsals with the stage and the production. So that process for the guest conductor is quite a rapid one, and it can probably be quite daunting.
And I was going to ask about that, actually. I mean, how much as an orchestra member do you feel part of a production? You know, as you said, you know, the cast and the production team have been in rehearsals for weeks and weeks and weeks, draining every nuance out of every word, out of every action, and then the orchestra just sort of slots in towards the end of that process. I mean, do you really kind of feel part of a production being in an orchestra?
You can do, depending on how open your mind is, but I don't think it's essential. I think at the end of the day, we turn up and sit in our seat and play as well as we can in collaboration with our colleagues and the conductor. And let's face it, most of the players in the orchestra have their backs to the action anyway. So there's no sense that you can be a part of something if you can't even see it. So I think it's different for different people. For me, some operas I really love to get involved in, the action, the story, the arias. But as I say, it's not essential for you to give of your best. That is the communication, to me, goes orchestra through the conductor and onto the stage, roughly speaking.
Well, that was another question I was going to ask. That relationship between kind of pit and the stage, or sort of, you know, orchestral member and the singer. Is it very much you just have to have the complete sort of faith in the conductor to be that sort of channel between kind of the triangle? Again, kind of how much do you feel as though you are, I suppose, kind of working with the singers, and how much is it just kind of the conductor being the complete channel between those elements?
Well, it depends on the piece, but with our more familiar and core repertoire, you will find that most of the players are readily familiar with the work. Let's say Traviata, Tosca, La Bohème, Marriage of Figaro, and they know how to accompany. And in all the most difficult acoustics, and I'm talking about most of the acoustics we play in, the orchestral pit is not an easily manageable space for an orchestra. And sometimes, again, we in the pit, and I'm thinking of let's say the Lowry Theatre, where the pit is deep. If you hear anything coming off the stage at all, you're very lucky. So in moments like that, we have to depend upon the clarity of movement from the conductor. But most of the time, we know what's coming and we know what might happen. And I think, bearing all of that in mind, opera orchestras become fairly tremendous at accompanying. How much a part of that is the conductor is variable, I think. If it's a modern piece with difficult rhythms and a piece that nobody knows, then the conductor is absolutely vital. So it varies from piece to piece, I would say.
And you mentioned there about the repertoire that the orchestra obviously knows so well, your Traviatas, your Figaros. I mean, the question I always like to ask people is, you know, how do you, the 1,000th time that you've played in Traviata, I mean, how do you kind of keep being excited about these pieces? How do you kind of keep that kind of artistry and sort of sometimes spontaneity going with things that you've just done so many times before?
Well, I think there's one good rule of thumb, which is try and imagine you're a member of the audience coming to see this for the very first time. You've got to take that attitude. For me, getting excited about an opera comes easy with some pieces. Most pieces, I would say. And so actually the buzz of performing presses back any kind of feeling of routine, if I can put it that way. And so I think that's when you decide what your favorite opera is, because you are really happy at the prospect of playing it again, maybe for the 100th time, like me and Figaro, for instance. And so there's no problem about a stale performance coming out because of over familiarity.
And kind of very briefly, what are some of your favourite operas? And you mentioned there are some that you're not quite so keen on. I don't know if you can maybe tell us maybe just one or two of those as well, where it's a bit more of a struggle to kind of get the
yeah. All right, I'll try. I'll try, David. I wrote a little list this morning, and I keep crossing things off, putting them back on. You know, they say as you get older, and I suppose I am a little bit old now, you kind of go through that great repertoire of the Romantic period and the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and you find your way. You find yourself going all the way back to Bach and Mozart and Beethoven, and that's where I've ended up. So if I had to pick one opera now today, it would have to be The Marriage of Figaro. That is a piece I could play. I probably played it 150 times. Had a brief check, something like that. And if I had to play, let's say, some Donizetti or Bellini 150 times, I think I'd probably die. Those sorts of operas, you know, I think you're bound to know what I'm talking about, but an opera which is very, very singer orientated, with the orchestra providing what is relatively a simple accompaniment throughout the opera. There may be a half decent overture and a prelude in the middle somewhere. And I'm not talking about Verdi, not in the slightest bit. But those sorts of operas are tough for the orchestra. And if you ask a second violin player, for instance, very tough, because they'll spend get my arms up here for you. Where am I going? They'll spend their whole evening going, chuck, 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 and the violas too. That sort of opera is less interesting to an orchestra player. So I'm going to go for The Marriage of Figaro, and I'm going to go for La Bohème as a very, very close second, Puccini. And then it has to be the Ring Cycle, which is a very special sort of experience and an immense, and it takes over your soul doing that piece, but it's got to be up there.
Well, we'll certainly come on to the Ring Cycle and some others a little bit later. Let's go back then to kind of 1977, 1978, the start of Opera North. What was your background kind of coming into it? I know that you were obviously very, very young and fresh-faced at the time, coming into the leader of an orchestra. You know, how did kind of the job come about? How did you kind of get into the start of Opera North?
Well, if I'm going to be honest, David, I was just fairly average at college. There were some far better violin players at college than me. So I tootled along, thought, well, okay, got to the end of my fourth year, better find a job. I did get a job. It was in what is now the Birmingham Royal Ballet, was then called the Sadler's Wells Royal Ballet. Not a full-time job, but a 30 weeks of the year job. It was great, had a lot of fun. That was the 1977 to 78 season. And sometime during that period, there was an advertisement put out for a new orchestra, a new opera orchestra, a new opera company, the entire company, to be formed in Leeds starting in September of 1978. And my teacher persuaded me not only to go for a job in that orchestra, but to go for the leader's job. And not having huge amounts of self-confidence, I thought, well, okay, give it a go. And I managed to get through two really tough auditions of an hour each. I'll never forget them. They're etched in my mind, really. And got the job, age 22, leader of a new professional orchestra in the UK. That was just the beginning, really. I mean, I clearly hadn't a clue what I was doing, because you don't, in those days, I think it's different now, the conservatoires are really good in these areas of orchestral discipline. But there was no training at the Royal College of Music in the early 70s for how to be a leader. Generally speaking, it would be find the flashiest player with the greatest amount of confidence, plonk him or her in the leader's seat, and let them fly with it. I couldn't do that. I had to learn how to make a section play together, and then this long process of people skills, which I didn't possess much of at all. And I suppose that's the one of the largest development features of my time at Opera North has been talking to people. I'd like to think. A lot of my colleagues might disagree with me horribly, but that's what I feel I've developed with more than anything else.
As you were saying at the beginning, obviously, they saw the talented violinist in you, but that personality as well, that it didn't have to necessarily be the flashiest, kind of most confident violinist, but there was also something about your personality that they thought that's the kind of person that we need taking on this new exciting and slightly daunting job. Well,
to my great fortune, my two teachers at the Royal College of Music were firstly a bloke called Felix Koch, who was the leader of the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra for a good couple of decades, I think, under the baton mostly of Louis Fremeau. And then my second teacher was also a kind of freelance leader in London, and his teaching was not just of the violin, but of the things I spoke of just a few minutes ago. How to sit at the front of a section, sit at the front of an orchestra. Told me loads of stories about fearsome conductors that made me quake. But I began to realise the sorts of things that his name was John Ludlow, still alive today. I'm in touch with him quite a lot. Who would, I think, as I've tried to explain, try and make the best of a situation for your colleagues. He said to me, when the chips are down, you're a member of the orchestra. You're not a lackey of the conductor. You're not a member of the management. You are a player in the orchestra. And those are the words that have stuck with me the most. So yes, I had no training or skills for that particular seat in 1978. So a real classic example of having to learn on the job.
I mean, I suppose a lot of you were kind of learning together. You say it was the first kind of permanent opera company in the north of England, and there was obviously a lot of civic investment in the scheme. But was there ever any worry that Opera North was going to be kind of a short-lived thing? It was just launching up. You're kind of coming into it fresh. 42 years later, still going strong. But at the start, were there ever any worries that this just might not work?
There were many moments like that, and a lot of the players. I think I hope I've remembered this right. I think there was a mix of maybe 75% people like me, fresh out of college, 25% the other end of their careers. And it was quite an interesting mix. And for the young ones, that larger 75% chunk, there was always this fear that because it was a new company, nobody had heard of it. And that perception lasted for quite some years. You'd talk to some old colleagues from down in London, and they'd say, where is Leeds? Just remind me. Oh, there's an opera company. That lasted for ages, and it made us think that we weren't ever quite on the map for quite some time. And I think, I happen to know that in the early 80s, there were one or two moments, really dark moments, when the company was in great peril. I only learnt that sort of after the event, but during that early period, therefore, it was very difficult to recruit new players because they were looking for a job for life, maybe. And Opera North, English National Opera North, as it was first known, didn't provide that security until way into the 80s, when we became much more of a national force.
Going back to 1978, I mean, the opening opera of Opera North was Samson Dana by Sanson. It seems like a bit of an odd choice. What was it about Samson that kind of made it right for the launch of this opera company in the north of England?
I think it was a brilliant choice, actually. I know what you mean, because it's not a vastly popular piece, but it's an opera that employs all forces of the company. Big chorus piece, big orchestral piece, lots of potential technical stuff in the production on stage, and some amazing principal singing roles. So actually, I thought it was a great choice. Alongside that, in that very same season, we played La Bohème, which I suppose is a piece that is the opposite. You know, the most popular piece. What are you going to start an opera company with? La Bohème, of course. And then an interesting double bill, Purcell and Poulenc, I think. Yeah.
Oh, was it
Dido?
Stravinsky?
No, we did Dido and Aeneas, coupled with a short opera by Poulenc, which is again a really odd piece. But in that first year, 78 to 79, the company produced 12 operas, 12 opera productions, and that's not lasted. I mean, it couldn't. But I mean, we're now down to, well, we're down to nothing at the moment. But typically in the last few years, 6 opera productions, and then the big one in the spring, where we would squeeze in the ring cycle and concert performances of Aida and Turandot and Salome. So, I mean, still a very, very big year's program of work.
Certainly big pieces to end the year on as well. Certainly no small undertakings trying to do those, and so certainly not a ring cycle.
Yeah.
Just kind of finally on that kind of opening season, I mean, what do you kind of have any memories of that opening night, both in terms of how the performance went and just kind of what the feeling in the kind of the company was at that time?
Well, yeah, I do. It was an amazing evening, live on Radio 3, and a Leeds audience, or a Leeds-based audience, that was just so ready for something like an opera company in the city. And it was a joyous night. I mean, that's all I can tell you. It was the month-long run-in to the first night, November the 15th, 1978, culminating in, as you said, Samson and Delilah. It was tremendous. I mean, it was such a feeling of achievement from every member of the company, and that lasted. That feeling went on most of the year, I would say, and then we knew that we were onto something really big. It was great.
42 years on, Opera North still going strong. You're still going strong at Opera North. What are kind of some of those moments over that time that really kind of stand out for you? If you can kind of just pick the highlights in that time.
Well, there's a random little selection. Some of them are funny in hindsight, but not funny at the time. So
those are my favourite.
Yeah, well, I've got a couple of those. So, speaking of Samson and Delilah, when we were on tour with that piece after the Leeds season, I think we were in Nottingham, and there was a terrible catastrophe on stage, which led to the scenario that in Act 3, when Samson pushes the pillars to dismantle the temple, the temple had dismantled about 20 minutes earlier because somebody tripped over the wrong piece of cable. So poor old Samson, this French tenor, I remember him, he just went through the motions, but there were no bricks left. Everything had gone. It was all, and we could have killed ourselves. You know, it was so funny after the event, but it was a real catastrophe. The other one I remember is a bit more recently. We played, excuse me, we were playing The Turn of the Screw, one of Britain's chamber operas. So there was only me as the first violinist, single players, and there's a lot of this strumming pizzicato stuff in Turn of the Screw, which you either do in guitar position or traditional. And I made this amazing swipe on a fortissimo pizzicato chord, and I managed to break 2 strings out of 4, and the 3rd string wound itself down completely. And I just looked at it. You know, normally you would just it happens. Dive into your case, get a new string, put it on. But 2 strings, 3 strings, it took me a whole act. And I would just put the fiddle down occasionally and try and play a little twiddle that was crucial on the wrong string, and then I'd go back to putting my strings back on. But it was a horrendous moment, but it's very funny to think back on it.
Well, in both of those instances, there are kind of 2 kinds of people out there. There's the one kind that will find a way to get on. They'll find a way to look past the fact that the temple doesn't exist anymore, and then there's the others where sort of blind panic sets in.
Yes, yeah.
I
think all these things,
people,
these things are so much easier to recount several years later when the feelings have gone away.
But what about any of those kind of moments that, maybe where things didn't go wrong, but things went extremely right? You know, those kind of real kind of standout moments.
Yeah, well, I've thought about that. I'm going to come back to any time we do a performance of Mozart, particularly the Marriage of Figaro, with a really good conductor and really good singers. That's a memorable evening for me, because I just think the music is unbeatable, and it shows off the orchestra. It shows off singing. Doesn't involve the chorus very much. That's the only disadvantage of Marriage of Figaro. But we have to do it, and we do it regularly, and it's my favourite piece. And then bearing in mind that Opera North Orchestra is a symphony orchestra as well. I remember a performance of Mahler's Second Symphony in Leeds Town Hall with both Leeds. You know, Leeds has 2 choruses, the Festival and the Philharmonic Chorus, and they joined together. Big orchestra, obviously, probably 85, 90 players, but the core is Opera North, the Orchestra of Opera North. And we played Mahler 2, and it was the most amazing performance I can remember at all. And it was that sort of concert that when it was over, we'd sort of reluctantly start to walk off the stage, and the audience didn't leave. Some of the audience members sat there for, 10, 15 minutes after the concert was over. So it was the most inspiring event that I can remember, apart from the ring cycle, which I know we might come on to. So those 2 sort of elements of music are the ones that today stick in my mind.
Well, you know you're doing your job that day when the audience won't leave, when they can't get up from their seats. That's a job well done day, isn't it?
Agreed. Yeah, that's right.
You mentioned it there. The ring cycle, I suppose, is the moment that a lot of people will think about with Opera North. Still a relatively recent event, but such a momentous undertaking and such an absolutely extraordinary series of performances. And I saw one of the full cycles in Leeds. It was just absolutely tremendous. I've spoken to Richard Farnes for one of our documentaries earlier this year about the ring cycle and the importance to a conductor of the ring cycle. What about the importance to a leader of an orchestra of doing something on that scale? What kind of did doing the ring cycle mean to you?
Well, I don't know. It's hard to put it into words. It was just the most. I'm gonna talk about Richard Farnes for 1 minute, and if he was here, he'd absolutely hate it. You know, when you hear an instrumentalist play on the radio, and you can tell who it is, which implies that it's not so much about the music they're playing as who they are. And my favourite violinists are the opposite. People like Isaac Stern and Itzhak Perlman. You know that you're listening to a great violinist, but it's not about them, it's about the music. And that's what Richard Farnes is. He's, of all the conductors I've met or seen, he's the one that brings us to the music, and only that, not him. It's amazing. He's amazing. And because of who he is, you know, he's not known in the sense of Jimmy Levine or Bernstein or Schulte or Papano, but he's the same. He's in the same class. And that was the first most inspiring thing for me, to just sit in my seat and watch him conduct 18 hours of music absolutely selflessly and bring the very best out of the orchestra. And the format, which was what we call semi-staged, with the orchestra fully on show and the singers in front of the orchestra, so the opposite of an opera theatre where they'd be behind us. It gives for a very good sense of balance, more perfect balance between singers and orchestra. You probably noticed that yourself. We spend most of our lives worrying about whether we're too loud for the singers, and in a semi-staged format, which I think Opera North has made its own over the years, everything works perfectly for the orchestra, without fear of drowning out members of the audience. So Richard was able to bring absolutely the best out of us for every minute of that 18 hours. And because we played it, I think we might have, well, we'd previously done it in 4 segments over 4 years, going all the way back to 2012 probably. And then 2016 was the year that we put the whole thing together. And so from the beginning of March to mid-July, with the exception of 1 week, it was nothing but the Ring. In that 1 week off that we had, by the way, we had to play Mahler's 8th Symphony, which we could have done without at the time, but it was actually fantastic in the end.
Well,
so
to keep you working, you know.
Yeah, well, very much so. I mean, it just takes over your. I've never been a massive Wagner fan, but I'm just in awe of the scale in which he frames his work. It's extraordinary, and the challenge to try and play every note is actually futile. And I have it on great authority that Wagner, when he was, you've probably seen the scores, and I'm sure, just, you know, you just keep turning the page, and the pages are filled with black notes, semiquavers and worse. And then you come to realise that you are wasting your time a little bit by trying to nail every single semiquaver, that there is a bigger picture. And so all the fire music, for instance, is actually unplayable, pretty much. But so long as you frame it in your own mind as to what's possible and why you're doing it, that's how to address those horrendous passages.
Well, that's very reassuring for me, because I've never believed in playing all of the notes. There's too many notes.
Well, no, me too.
Just kind of find it on that ring cycle. Singers obviously talk about their routine and their eating and their warming up and to kind of get through a performance. I mean, is there sort of a patented kind of David Greed regime to get through, 5.5 hours of a good demo rung or whatever it might be, or not so much? Is it more mental fortitude than physical?
Well, it is. Well, for most instrumentalists, it's physical, of course, but there is this mental thing. So I thinking back, I wouldn't even try and do anything else on a day where a performance starts at 4 o'clock and finishes at, actually with intervals, finishes at 10:30 maybe. So you've just got to take it easy. You've got to eat at the right time. There's always a long interval in these big operas. So you can have a snack or a meal then, but you've got to actually think your way through the day. What shall I do when I've got up? Not too much. This is going to be exhausting. Have a meal at lunchtime, and then make sure, if we're going to get really graphic about this, Das Rheingold is 2 hours and 40 with no interval. So remember, folks, to go to the loo before you walk on the stage.
Yeah,
it's all that sort of stuff.
The audiences, you've got to get your timings right.
Yeah, absolutely. But as I say, a project that it will live in my mind for as long as I do, and I'm so pleased to have done it, because for many years at Opera North, you think, well, this is a great opera company, but how on earth are they ever going to be able to afford the ring cycle? Unfortunately, some money came to the company, and it was ring fenced to be used to produce the ring. So that was the motivation that the company needed to make it happen. And the greatest thing about it all, really, was when we took it to London and performed it at the Festival Hall, and the notices were incredible. It was a massive hit, really was.
Well, I think anyone that's seen it live or even online, the online experience is also fantastic. We'll be delighted that Opera North finally got around to the ring cycle a few years ago.
Just in time, yeah, for me.
Just in time for you, yeah. Well, I'm going to finish by kind of coming on to that. We've had one question in from the audience. So if anyone else watching at home has got a question, do send it in now, and we'll get to it in a minute or so. The final thing from me, David, was just to kind of talk about the here and now. I assume kind of the last few months is probably the longest you've gone in maybe 60 years of not performing in front of real people. But you did get back to live performance last week. I mean, how was that experience last Friday, and kind of how do you kind of feel things are kind of shaping up going forward, not just for yourself, but I suppose kind of opera and orchestral musicians more generally?
Right. Well, the thing about last week's concert was that we started this conversation a month ago, where the Leeds City Council was very keen to try and pilot a live concert with some kind of live audience. That would have been a first. And it got snatched away from us because of new legislation. And then the whole thing happened again 2 weeks after that, when we thought we were getting there. And then on one Friday, I remember it clearly, it was the beginning of the Snooker World Championships, because I was going to go there on the Saturday. There was an announcement on the Friday to say that phase 4, which was to do with indoor events with an audience, was to be postponed indefinitely. So we failed again. This time it happened, and it was amazing. I knew this was going to be an emotional event. First of all, I had to help direct it because we weren't having conductor. So we had a very energetic, quite tricky rehearsal on the day before, on the Thursday of last week, where we, for the first time, sat in our distanced seating, which puts think of the Mendelssohn Octet and a big semicircle of players. Well, this semicircle went right across the Leeds Town Hall stage. And so we had to become accustomed to fine-tuning our hearing and working really hard to play together, because it was not as easy as it normally is. But we managed it, and it was great. It was the most amazing performance. And when we walked out, here's the telling thing, David. We walked out onto the stage for the beginning of this concert, and the 250 strong audience, dotted and littered around the hall, they went mad. We just stood and had to soak up this applause and appreciation for like a couple of minutes, you know. And that's when the real importance of it sort of hit home. So the concert was a great success. Great comments from friends and people I know come to the opera a lot and concerts. So hopefully it's the early shoots of something much more positive developing, because it needs to. You know, where the industry is shattered. The whole entertainment industry is shattered, but the classical music opera world is in pieces, and it needs help. And you see so many wonderful things going out online. We were talking about it earlier before this went live. The things you can do online and stream, and it's great. And people are developing technical ways of doing this well. Even if you're like 50 miles apart, you can do a violin and piano duet, which I've tried to do. But of course, it isn't the same, is it? It's not the same as being in the hall. It never will be. Which is why I'm so pleased that, well, it looked for a moment like the last 2 weeks of the proms, that you might be able to do something similar to what we did last week. As it turns out, it's live but only streamed with no audience. But we've got to get over that next little hurdle, and then maybe we'll be okay. But in the meantime, and you'll be fully aware of this, that there are some amazing little arts companies, theatre companies that have not made it. They don't exist anymore, and that's one of our personal tragedies. People who inhabit the business. So,
yeah, undoubtedly very, very difficult times. But I think you're quite right in that what we have to do, and I think what we're all trying to do is pushing those ways to kind of get back, doing things safely, but kind of getting things back in front of audiences. And as you said, audiences are just so delighted to be able to get back. Hopefully, you know, your event and the events that we've been doing over the past few days as part of the festival are just kind of part of that story of getting things back up and running again.
Yeah.
I'm going to end just with a very quick question from a viewer at home, which I think is a very good question. They say, whenever I leave the theatre of an Opera North performance, the orchestra have already got onto the street before we've got out. Which section of the orchestra is the fastest to leave their seats?
Ooh. And I think we're all pretty equally determined to get home and have a glass of wine. That's a good question. There are certain operas, as you will well know, or maybe you don't, where a little, I think Carmen is like this. You come out, the one particular section of the orchestra actually finishes before the opera does. So they'll be way gone by the time we've taken our applause. I think the respectful answer is that we leave in a very circumspect way when we're allowed to. I'm going to leave it at that.
A very diplomatic answer. Thank you, David, so much for joining us this lunchtime. We've got 2 more events as part of this year's Leeds Opera Festival. At 3 o'clock today, I'm talking to Sophie Horrocks and Ian and Peter Fraser about researching opera. How do we find out about opera's hidden past? And at 6 o'clock, we'll be announcing details of our 2021 Leeds Opera Festival live on YouTube. All of the events we've had on the past 5 days are online for you to view for free. If you've enjoyed this event or any of the events of the past 5 days, please consider making a donation to Northern Opera Group. You can do so on our website or by texting NOG, that's N-O-G, to 70085 to donate £5. Thank you for joining us today. A huge thank you to David. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and hopefully the sunshine will keep it up. And just a thank you again for joining us. And we hope to see you at 3 o'clock for our next event. Goodbye.